This was 1998 when this happened. An old friend of mine asked me to go camping with him. I hadn't been since I was about 12, so I agreed. It sounded fun and I was excited all week leading up to the trip. I didn't get much sleep that night before because of it. He picked me up just after 5 a.m. and we drove the 100 miles to the park. I managed to get a bit of sleep, so I felt a little better when we arrived. Then he dropped the bomb on me. We still had to walk another 2 hours to the campsite. I tried to talk him into choosing one a little bit closer, but he swore I would love it when we made it. With a heavy heart, I followed him. The first half hour wasn't that bad. Most of it was downhill. However, as more time passed, I became sluggish. Halfway there, we took a short break, but were back on the trail before I knew it. The second leg was a lot more uphill. It wasn't long until I was dragging again and not paying attention to where I was going. We arrived at a flat section and I got relieved. My friend was in front and somehow missed the trap, but I didn't. All I remember was that 1 second I was clomping down and hitting the ground the next. The contact with the bottom of the hole jolted me awake, and the rush of adrenaline masked most of the pain. As I stood up, my right leg buckled, and I dropped down onto a sharpened stick jutting out below me. Apparently there were several more stakes in the bottom of the hole, but they had been knocked over, thankfully. When I looked down, I saw the bone sticking out of my shin. I pulled the stick from my leg, and the pain made me even queasier than I was already. I looked up to get an idea of where I was, and only saw blue sky edged by trees. I figured the hole was about 10 feet deep or more. It must have taken the idiots that dug it several days. I yelled up for my friend only to see his laughing face greet me over the edge. He didn't know the extent of my injuries at that moment, but when I told him, the laughing stopped and panic replaced it. I asked him what happened, and he told me it looked like some redneck poachers had dug some type of bear trap and I had fallen into it. I assumed he could simply reach down and pull me out, but that didn't work. So next, he attempted to reach me with a tree limb. This worked at first, but when I tried to stand up, the pain was far too severe. I couldn't put any weight on my right leg. It was obvious I wasn't getting out of the hole without outside help. It was still early in the day, so I wasn't very concerned. I could hear my friend pacing around above me and freaking out. So I called up to him in a calm voice and told him to get help. The ranger station was only a little over an hour back from where we came. He could easily get help and make it back to me with plenty of time before it got dark. Once he took off, I was left alone with nothing but pain to occupy me. By now it was coming in waves, and the accompanying nausea wasn't making it any better. Initially I thought I could make a splint, but the moment I tried to tighten it down, I almost fainted. Leaving it alone seemed like the wisest decision. I put my head between my legs and waited for the sick, dizzy feeling to pass. Eventually it did, and I tried to focus on other things. I singed for a while, that is until I started hearing thunder and noticed the skies above me were getting darker by the minute. Getting a little wet wasn't going to kill me, right? Perhaps I should have considered my circumstances before saying that. The rain was relatively light at first, but within minutes it was coming down in sheets. I was okay until I began to notice the hole filling with water. My feet were already submerged by the time I realized I was in trouble. I clawed my way up into the top until I was standing, at least the best that I was able to, and I started praying for it to stop. As the minutes passed, more of my body disappeared. After an hour, the storm began letting up and I could relax. The water level was only about halfway up my shins, and I knew now if it continued at that rate, help would be here before it even reached my waist. Unfortunately, it was just a lull in the storm. Soon enough, the rain was sheeting down again. The only positive about the whole thing was it had taken my mind off the pain in my leg. I tried to be upbeat, thinking back on funny jokes in movies. The next hour was the longest hour of my life. When help finally arrived, the rain had almost completely stopped. At the time the ropes pulled me out, the water was still just below my belt. Thinking about drowning to death in a little hole out in the middle of nowhere still gives me the chills. Once I was out of the hole, the ride to the hospital went by fast. After a surgery where I acquired some screws and a few plates, I was allowed to go home. The next 8 weeks on crutches would drag by, but I was just happy to be alive, broken leg or not. We never got to make up for the lost trip, but I have taken my kids out camping a few times in the years since. While it's on my mind, I may give my friend a ring. We haven't seen one another in a few years, and a camping trip may be the best way to catch up, and I'll make sure to keep my eyes open this time. The argument started the same way, every time. You'll never catch me dead in a national park. They're full of nothing but fat tourists and RVs. I'm from the old school, and I like it that way. Old school was a kind of description of how he camped. If it was made from anything other than canvas or leather, he considered it new-fangled junk. My mother tried, on multiple occasions, to introduce things as common now as nylon tents, but he was not having it. He would rather carry that big, musty wall tent everywhere we camped, and don't get me started about the stinking cans of kerosene that always leaked over everything. He certainly was a man that was born too late. The term roughing it had to have been coined with him in mind. We would continue to suffer through his archaic ways of experiencing the outdoors until the near death of my younger brother showed him the error of his ways. Throughout the early 80s, my dad would drag us out to the national forests during Thanksgiving. The weather was relatively mild for that time of year, and the forest was beautiful. I can still smell the pine trees. These retreats always seemed to coincide with hunting season for some reason. I remember hearing Dad used to hunt before meeting our mom. I think she forbade him from doing it anymore, so this was his way of sticking it to her. Either way, gunshots near camp were a common sound. I guess because our parents grew up with very little oversight, me and my brother Mike's childhood was the same. No one considered that it might be dangerous with a bunch of trigger-happy guys around to let two young boys play in the woods alone. It was normal for the two of us to leave camp at dawn, play all morning until lunchtime, and then go back until supper. We had been doing this as long as I can remember, and no one batted an eye. On one specific Thanksgiving, we had been running and crawling through the underbrush all day. This was during the time G.I. Joe and Rambo movies were at the height of their popularity. Mike and I loved dressing up in our camouflage clothes and playing war. Mike's birthday had just been a few days before, and he got a pair of G.I. Joe walkie-talkies. Looking back, they were junk, but we loved them. After lunch, we returned to the woods. I can't remember exactly what I was doing at that moment, but I know Mike was trying to sneak up on me. I was sitting on a fallen tree and suddenly heard a loud bang, quickly followed by a whistling, going by my head. I dropped flat on my stomach and waited for another shot. I wasn't sure what was happening, but something told me to stay where I was. No more than 30 seconds had passed when I heard faint moaning in the distance. Since Mike was missing at that second, I called him on the walkie-talkie. No answer came, but I heard a new noise. This sounded like my name, so I called Mike again. No answer. Now I was getting scared. Without any other ideas, I yelled out his name. I told him the game was over and we needed to go, and he needed to answer me. I wasn't sure if he was still trying to kick me or if he was actually in trouble. I listened very intently, but nothing but the faint rustle of leaves could be heard. I walked in the direction of the rustle and I listened again. Nothing. So I called out again. The rustling repeated, followed by another moan. I ran in that direction about 20 yards and I stopped. The rustling came again, just to my right and very close. I couldn't see anything, so I dropped to my stomach and I scanned the area. About 3 feet away, I spotted the bottom of a Nike shoe. I knew it had to be Mike. I ran to the brush that he was laying under. The sight that I came upon still breaks my heart to this day. There was Mike, staring up at me with a terrified look on his face. Just under his arm was a hole with blood pouring out of it. It shocked me, but I did my best to play it cool. I didn't want to make him any more scared than he already was. Had I been older, I may have known better how to move him, but I just reached down and I scooped him up in my arms. He was too heavy for me, but I was going to do my best to save him. I made it about 100 yards before I had sat down. He must have been in considerable pain. He asked me to leave him there and go get help. His voice sounded very weak, and I almost broke into tears right there. Somehow I held myself together, and I ran another mile or so without stopping. Mom must have known something was wrong. She yelled out in a panicked voice for my dad. My dad came out of the tent, took one look at me, and said, "How bad is it?" I was too winded to speak. I just pointed towards where I had set him down, and he took off. By the time I had caught up, my dad was already picking him up and headed for camp. The entire ride to the hospital, my mom kept talking to him, telling him to hold on. I rode in the back seat, holding my shirt against the wound the whole way there. What would have normally been at least a 30-minute drive took us just 20. Dad handed him off to the doctors. They had him in surgery within the hour, and the next 3 were a long, living nightmare. More than shocked at what had happened to my brother, I was in amazement at how calmly my parents were handling everything. Having become a parent since, I realized that they were far from calm, but they handled it well either way. It was after midnight when the doctors gave us the news. Things had been touch and go for a while. I only found out much later that Mike had died more than once during surgery, but Mike had a good chance of recovering completely. The police, having been notified of the shooting, arrived soon after dawn to question us. Now that the urgency of the situation had passed, I broke down several times during my recollection. That was the first time I came to grips with the possibility that I could have been shot myself. Mike was going to be in the hospital for a few weeks, so my parents got a hotel room nearby. I think my dad considered staying at the camp, but after a very short discussion with my mom, he decided against it. The detectives handling the case kept us up to date, but as late as the day Mike was discharged, no names have been connected to the case. The most wildly held theory is that a poacher mistook the movement in the bushes for a deer and fired. It accounts for the lack of red flags during the search through hunting licenses. It wasn't the first time this had happened, and sadly it won't be the last. Mike was one of the fortunate ones. 34 years have passed since, and nobody has been decisively connected to the shooting. Mike did make a full recovery and went on to start his own business and family, just like any other normal person. Something great did actually come out of this mess. We never returned to the national forest, and even better, Dad decided with all of those fat tourists with their RVs being around, it was a safer environment for he and his family. Being 12 and 17, I got to spend my holidays in awesome places like Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. This was the way that I always thought camping should be, peaceful and quiet, and I'm almost positive Mike would agree with me.